Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Tricia Rose, and I'm the director for the Center of the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America at Brown University and a professor in the Africana Studies Department. We are really delighted to have you with us today. In case you're unaware, I just want to give you a little bit of background on the center and this series that we are hosting today. CSREA is an interdisciplinary hub that aims to build community with the public and among scholars and students working on race and ethnicity, predominantly in the United States. We have many events that we hope you have been enjoying, and we hope that you will continue to participate. The brown.edu/race is the website for our center, and please join our mailing list if you have not already. Today is a very special event for me. It is going to be a fascinating and riveting conversation, I can promise you. The event is called The Future of Policing in America, a Third Rail Conversation with Connie Rice. And this event is part of the Third Rail lecture series, which is intended specifically to tackle complex and urgent and difficult subjects in a way that really hits on what we're calling the third rail. And we use it as this metaphor as a way to describe the kinds of situations that are very charged, very powerful, that they are often very polarizing as topics, but also that we think if they can be solved, we believe that the energy of this third rail type of issue can be, transformational. So what could possibly be more important than the future of policing in this country and frankly around the world? And so we have an amazing and extraordinary person with us today, Miss Connie Rice, who is a lawyer. I could be here all day with her bio, but let me spend a little bit of time because it's worth it. She's a lawyer, an author, a public intellectual of national renown for fighting systemic injustice with coalition lawsuits that have won over $10 billion in damages and policy changes that have helped millions of poor people and poor neighborhoods. She's advocated and earned over 50 major awards and prompted LA Magazine to call her the voice for LA's oppressed. She's was a member of Barack Obama's task force on 21st century policing, a national figure in police reform, and a leading expert in changing police culture. Her unique work has galvanized the police, poor residents, gang interventionists, and government agencies to jointly transform inner city safety to help end LA's gang epidemic homicide. She's also worked with other social change organizations around transportation and housing and the like. But because we're focusing on the police, I wanted to focus that aspect of her bio. But this is a Renaissance woman who is at the cutting edge of thinking, of policy and action and community building. And we are just fantastically excited to have Connie Rice with us today. Connie, welcome to the Third Rail Conversation at Brown University CSREA.
Thanks, Tricia Rose. I'm gonna have to earn that introduction.
No, you've long.
With you. Great to be
yes,
with you.
It's wonderful to see you again and to be with you. Boy, there's so much to do here today. And I just wanted to remind our audience, we're going to have a conversational format for about 50 minutes, if we can hold to that, and then spend the rest of our time, which is about another half an hour, talking. I'll field questions from the audience and send them to you, Connie, for your review and consideration, and then we'll close at about an hour and a half from now. But so let's start where we just started a minute ago, before we opened up the webinar to the audience, and that was to really think about where we are now. Let's sort of start where we are now, and maybe go back a bit in time. But we've seen the most extraordinary public protests in probably ever, if you look at the numbers, but in terms of consequence, not since the 1960s have you seen this level of public outrage about police violence and brutality in poor non-white communities, especially Black and also Latinx. And I think many of us are wondering, what changes will this bring, right? Where are we? Is this a turning point? Is it something that will really create the kind of systemic and cataclysmic change that's necessary, or is it just going to be another blip on the radar? And how might we evaluate that?
You know, it's too early to tell, Tricia. I mean, I wish I could say that 20 million plus folks marching in a pandemic, an extraordinary movement launched from a hashtag. Think about the skill that that takes. I mean, 100 years of my lawsuits couldn't have launched a movement like that. So I don't want to in any way diminish the power or the significance of of what happened last summer. And not just the demonstration, but the ethos and the vision behind that movement.
Mm-hmm.
I also know, after 40 years of being in this business of dealing with policing, that nothing that happened last summer is going to fundamentally reduce the shootings or change how inner city policing is done, structured, executed. That the legislation, I'm helping Congresswoman Bass, who has done a yeoman's job in trying to get the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act passed. All of the stuff in that act is excellent stuff to do. It also is not going to change the mindset and the behavior and the conditions in the communities and the culture and incentives that cops respond to. So a lot of what you're seeing is extremely significant on a political level,
Mm-hmm.
on a national agenda setting level, on making police reform or transformation, because they're two different things, central to a national debate. A president cannot get elected without now engaging on these issues. All of that stuff is critical. It's very, very important. But when people ask me, is it going to change the number of videos we see? The answer is no. Is it going to change the fundamental dynamics and physics of policing culture in inner cities? Because the policing that's done in inner cities is almost 180 degrees different from what you see in exurbia and suburbia. So we're talking,
let's go right there, because that's the critical. Tell our participants and audience members today, what is inner city policing like, right?
Yeah.
Because, you know, when we hear the stories, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that many people still think of these as sort of an occasional bad apple policeman, right? That we indict a given individual police person for their actions, as if their actions are beyond the pale as individuals. But when you say inner city policing, you're referring to a collective national phenomenon. Speak to that for us, would you?
Yeah, this is what I say to I'm on several commissions, and a lot of my co-commissioners, they talk about policing generally. And I tell them, I said, look, in suburbia, you get concierge safety. The police chief asks to have lunch with the woman who owns the estate I live on. Okay. I live in a neighborhood of gated communities. I'm in the gardener's cottage, but I live in a very wealthy neighborhood because of my law partner's wealth. And we get concierge safety. My clients who live 10 miles south of Pasadena and Beverly Hills and the wealthy gated communities of Los Angeles, which is where I am, they receive in those areas where we have abandoned these communities. These are communities that are redlined. They are targeted for defunding. So I always say refund the community. They have been disinvested. They are without grocery stores, basic services, amenities, banks, credit unions, all of the things that we know that you have for a ghetto. And when you were talking about enforcement in a ghetto, you're not talking about safety. Suburbs get safety. Inner cities get mass incarceration, search and destroy, enforcement. And it feeds into a mass incarceration national policy, wars on gangs, wars on drugs. It criminalizes the entire community and licenses a policing that is without constitutional constraint. So when I call it shock and awe, a former LAPD police chief whom I ended up aligning with after I always introduce him as I liked Charlie Beck the second time I sued him. Because I used to wake up every morning. 40 years ago, I would wake up every morning, and in the shower, I would think of a new way to sue LAPD and the LA sheriffs. We were at war. There was no touching them. They had absolute immunity and impunity. They could do whatever they wanted. In those days, we knew of death squads. I actually was the target of one of those, and the good cops would find a phone booth. For you younger folks, it's in the Smithsonian. Look it up. We didn't have cell phones. We didn't have dial phones. You know, I'm old enough. We had phone booths. It's a little box that had a phone. You put a dime in it and you dial. Those cops, Tricia, would call me in the daytime because they knew I would come down at Watts at night, because you can't tell what the cops are doing unless you observe what they're doing on graveyard shift in the ghetto. You can't do it from your office. If you're not on the ground, you don't know. If you're not on the ground, you don't know what the gang members are doing, because the cops will lie to you and the gang members will lie to you. And if you're not in the emergency rooms at 2 o'clock in the morning, you don't see the shotgun victims and you don't see the cross color shootings. You can't collect the data. Long story short, they would know that I was coming down there at 2 o'clock in the morning, and the good cops, black, white, Latino, you know, every race you can think of. There were very few women back then, but they would call from the phone booth and they would say, Connie, don't come down to Watts. Graveyard is gunning for you and we can't protect you. So this is 40 years ago. And what we were seeing was the beginning of the unfolding of the mass incarceration, mass criminalization strategies that police are assigned to carry out. So when I'm on these commissions, I say you need to distinguish between the policing that the favored communities on the thin blue line. We have us versus them, thin blue line policing. If your community is on the wrong side of that thin blue line, you get shock and awe, search and destroy, mass incarceration. If you're on the right side of that thin blue line, you get concierge safety and protection. What the discussion we need to have is, what does it take to provide safety in our bottom of the well, spiral of despair neighborhoods? Because this isn't just about policing. It's not about bad apples. It's about a toxic orchard, not just a bad barrel. We're talking about a system of policing that descends directly from slavery. So I was on a panel with Chief Bill Bratton about maybe a month ago, and he was asked, what's wrong with American policing? Because we were on a panel together to talk about why the reforms that have happened haven't benefited George Floyd, didn't benefit Rodney King, haven't benefited any of the others that you can assign snuff videos to, from Garner to Castile to Taylor to all of them, even last month's killings. The changes in policing haven't touched the street. They haven't touched the DNA of a kind of policing that we orchestrated 400 years ago. And when Bratton was asked, you know, what's the problem with policing, he said, well, on my journey with Connie, what I've learned is that the problem with American policing began in 1619, when the first cops enforced order on the slave ships. Now, does that mean that today's officers think of themselves as slave catchers or slave overseers? No, they see themselves as carrying out an assignment of containment suppression to make sure the violence and the despair don't escape the ghetto. They see themselves as keeping the rest of society safe from undesirable areas, high crime zones, gang zones, poverty zones. And what we have to do is flip the paradigm from one of exclusion and containment and suppression, which actually crushes people who are already struggling in deprivation. Flip that to, how do you make these communities healthy enough to be safe? And then you can send, doesn't have to be police, it can be safety officers. You have to reorganize government to deliver services that support a wraparound safety strategy. You empower the community to provide a lot of their own safety. Now, you're going to need police because the rest of society is not going to allow you to get rid of police. You know, this isn't South Africa. It's not Norway either. This is the United States of America. And we're still coming out of a slaveocracy. And until, so things that you could do in South Africa, you can't do here because we're not the majority. And so this is This is a conversation within those communities, which doesn't include me and people like you, and doesn't include people like us. Those
Right.
communities who live in those conditions. I don't live in those conditions. I live in privileged neighborhoods. But the folks who live in those neighborhoods will tell you, we want protection, we want safety, we want the ability to be able to be healthy enough not to suffer the trauma and the violence of the ghetto.
So yes, that's brilliant. Thank you. So let me play a little devil's advocate to help you, to help the audience here and you drill down a little bit more. So if we're saying, and I think I heard you properly when you said that these are communities that have more violence, more crime, and that perhaps some of this is the result of things that happened in the past, what should, suburban communities do, right? Isn't it, why are they responsible, right, for these problems that are happening somewhere else? And shouldn't they be protected from it? How do we convince people who have this perspective to understand how these things are related to one another?
I think that what you have to do is reassure the privileged communities that their safety will not diminish because we decide to provide safety to the poor.
Mhm.
What you have, and we've demonstrated that. The type of policing that I'm talking about isn't a concept. It has been done. It has been done beyond a pilot stage. It's still a large demonstration. It's called partnership policing. It
Mhm.
isn't even called, I don't even call it policing. It's a safety strategy in which
Mhm.
officers who are assigned to be guardians, who are partners with communities, who are empowered and paid and compensated, everything from professional gang interventionists who do foot patrols. They have life insurance, they have salaries from the city. We created a gang reduction and youth development base of power within the city council to be able to run these programs. You have a philanthropic arm, you have other kinds of institutions like the Children's Institute, you have local leaders, you have grassroots leaders, there's both formal and so you create a wraparound strategy with
Mhm.
everybody who's a stakeholder in that community's health, as well as outside advisors and experts like me, and gang anthropologists from UCLA and USC, nurses, public health officials from the county government. You have a roundtable that plans the safety strategy for what began in housing projects, public housing projects. So some of the poorest folks in LA County, with some of the highest gang dominion areas of the county where gangs actually control the parks, the libraries, the pools, the school hallways. You unwind that control without making a whole bunch of arrests, because one of the goals of holistic safety is not to increase the incarceration level. You are to make a community that is plagued and been left in violence and crime and gang control, and you take that community and you get it repositioned to actually get rid of those negative dynamics and factors holistically, which means without a whole bunch of shock and awe enforcement and arresting and imprisoning more people. It means using public health strategies, sociological strategies, getting rid of the criminogenic conditions in a neighborhood. The
Mhm.
grandmothers will tell you, look, clean up Grape Street Alley and help us bring in medical vans and help us give the gang guys who are reachable and gang and women in gangs reach some alternatives. Don't
Mhm.
let them claim our children. Have after school activities, wrap around summer activities. You put in millions of dollars into these communities, and guess what? The violent crime goes down, the trauma goes down, the
Mhm.
arrests. We did it without arrests, and we ended the youth gang homicide and what the epidemic that the World Health Organization, it's not my word, it's the World Health Organization came in and evaluated the gang violence in Watts and in East LA, two poor areas of the LA County, and determined we had epidemic levels of both. We tried this holistic public health safety strategy, Tricia, and the gang homicide rate
Mm.
plummeted. In
Mm.
Jordan Downs housing project for 3 years in a row, when you had cops doing foot beats, cops who were considered guardians. They partnered with gang interventionists and did foot patrols. They weren't swooping in black and whites with sirens and extracting folks and pruning people out and throwing them on the ground and stopping people for air fresheners at gunpoint. You know, that paramilitary, hyper vigilant craziness that you see in the videos disappeared. You had cops who were with the community. They knew everybody's name. They knew who was on medication. Instead of arresting people for mental breakdowns, they called public health. They had first responders come in, which is what Black Lives Matter was saying. They actually did
Right.
it. They did it. Crime plummeted, trauma plummeted, the violence plummeted. They had 3 years in a row in Jordan Downs housing project, which the Grape Street Crips kind of owned for a long time. 0 homicides. That's like going to a brothel and being told there were 0 sex acts. Okay. We used to do body counts weekly for Jordan Downs and Nickerson Gardens
Wow.
and Imperial
Right.
Courts and Watts. So we know how to do it, but you have to tell the wealthy your safety is not going to diminish because we actually serve and protect poor people. And we demonstrate
It's actually going to go up. Your safety will
your
go up.
safety is going to go up because you're not going to have race riots triggered by cops.
Right.
And so we know the answer. The question is, why is there no political will to do it?
Right, right. And one more detail. My instinct is that it's probably sounds more expensive, but is actually cheaper.
Well,
right. I mean, what are the relative costs, you know, for the economists who might be in the audience who are not necessarily on the ethical spectrum? Right. What are the relative differences in cost between policing, mass incarceration versus this kind of community partnership safety?
So the policing component costs more. The city has to reallocate what it's spending money on. Instead of spending money on its jails, it channels it into SMART teams, the first responders, to areas where there's a lot of homelessness, for example. You have a SMART team that has a mental health, a psychiatrist or a psychologist. You have to reorganize county government to have first responder teams. Every single department has to have a first responder team, be it public works, mental health, public health, the violence reduction and prevention office, the social workers, families and children's services. All of those folks, you have to have at least 10% of those departments deployed for first responder. They can't just sit in front of their computer screens and prepare their bosses for staff meetings. They actually have to be out in the world helping to solve problems as part of a team. Now, that means reorganizing government. It means reorganizing the union contracts because the unions didn't want their folks having to roll out at 2:00 in the morning. Well, guess what? If you're a mental health worker and you're a first responder, you don't get to schedule the mental crises. You got to roll out when you're needed. So what I'm saying is that it's a heavy lift because you have to reorganize the rest of government. You have to reassure the rest of society that thinks their safety depends on making sure that Pookie and Shaniqua don't come into their neighborhood. So containment, suppression policing is what they want because they don't want folks from these neighborhoods coming out to the beach or coming up to their neighborhood or getting on the train and going to the airport. In fact, that's what our transportation cases were about. We found the smoking gun memos that showed that the bus system in LA actually measured the distance that was too far for African Americans from Watts to walk to the beach, and they ended the bus line there to make sure that African Americans couldn't make it to the beach. So when you talk about systemic wiring for racial suppression and racial oppression, it isn't in the past. This was 35 years ago. Okay?
Right.
Long enough for me and my teams to have done a case that challenged those racist policies. So you ask, what are the savings? Just to give you one, because UCLA has evaluated this model and found that not only does it increase trust, reduce crime at a faster and steeper rate than the overall declines, because violent crime has been declining up until the pandemic, has been declining for the last 25 years. Even in the inner city, police killings have also declined. It's just that they're now on video and they're less deniable by the white public. But just take gang intervention. Professionally trained former gang members who decide they want to atone for the mayhem they caused in their neighborhoods. These are men and women who are former gang members. They are paid a salary. They go through professionalism. It's their curriculum. for helping keep ambulances safe after gang shootings, hospitals safe when an assassination doesn't happen. Because when the kill didn't go through, they would come to the OR room and shoot up the nurses and all the patients trying to get their target. So they do wraparound hospital safety, wraparound school safety. They have safe passages for elders. They do foot patrols with the officers to keep everybody safe, and the 24/7.
Mhm.
So what does gang intervention say? They did an evaluation to show that when professionally trained gang intervention rolls out to a gang homicide scene, when they roll out, there's a huge difference, because when LAPD's gang unit only rolls out, they stop the retaliation shootings about 24% of the time. And 24% of the cases after a gang unit by itself responds to a gang homicide, there's a 24% of the time there's a retaliation shooting. Those retaliation shootings cost millions of dollars. When they roll out with professionally trained former gangsters who know the community, stop the rumors, protect the retaliation volleys from happening,
Mhm.
they prevent them, 0.7% of the time you get a retaliation shooting. 24% versus 0.7. You wiped out the retaliation shootings. The value of that, because
Mm.
each retaliation shooting, LAPD even agreed that in 1 year alone, no, over a 2 year period, the intervention practice saved over $110 million.
Mm. And it put
$110
people to
million.
work protecting their community,
Exactly.
not just atoning, but being role models for young people to imagine another way of responding
Exactly.
to the
That's just one
circumstances.
aspect. So 110 million saved
Mhm.
just for that 2 years. Now it's been going for 14 years now. So you
Mhm.
total that up. Compare
Right.
that to the cost of keeping a kid in our child prisons. You know, they spend $1 million a year to keep a kid in a child prison.
Mhm.
Uh, and the coalition, the justice coalitions out here of young folks have shut 9 of those prisons. It's been a
Yeah.
huge community movement, but we still have at least 2. And the
Yeah.
costs of incarcerating 12 and 11-year-olds and 14-year-olds who've been charged as adults is $1 million. Think of the cost of sending them to college as opposed to
Right.
that.
Right. Right.
So
So yeah.
that's the picture of the impact
Right.
that this new strategy, a wraparound safety
Mhm.
strategy, can have.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it sounds fantastic. And it's not only that we have to educate the public around why this kind of shock and awe, incarceration based policing is really problematic. But we also have to figure out how to impact warrior culture, as you call it, right? Because the kind of policing you're describing does not, as you point out, rely on the kind of warrior culture that many police departments promote or enable or allow, depending on the situation. Talk a little bit about this notion of warrior culture and how we can transform it to to make a change. You talked about in a really interesting article about police world, right? You said in police world, right, there's one way of thinking, and in the community there's an entirely different one. And it seems that warrior culture is a critical piece of this gap. So could you share a little bit more about that for everyone?
Yeah, and I know it's annoying to hear me talk about policing through cops' eyes, but the reason that I do that is that civil rights cases don't touch this stuff. We win every case, but we don't change the fundamental physics of American policing. And
Mhm.
we legislate, we litigate, we march, we protest, we write papers. We're the Bob Muellers of police policy papers. You know, we've done it all for 40 for and really police reform, if you really look at it, has only been going on for 30 years. If you look at it, police abuse have been going on for 400 years, but the reform has only been going on for 30. I speak about what officers need to change because they have the power. And I know I've been asked, Connie, why don't these videos change? Why don't the standards and law that protect and give them immunity change? Chauvin would have gotten qualified immunity for murdering George Floyd. That's how twisted the legal doctrines are. Had Minneapolis not settled that suit, because 30 days after Chauvin murdered Mr. Floyd, Dallas officer sat on the neck and back of a mentally ill man in Dallas for 14 minutes, killed him, and got qualified immunity. So had Minneapolis not settled that case with the Floyd family and Mr. Crump's advocacy getting that settlement, Chauvin would have received immunity for the murder.
So tell me why, and tell me why that's the case. Why does not settling lead to him automatically getting qualified immunity?
Well, if I were Chauvin's lawyer, I'd raise qualified immunity. I'd say he was immune. He was carrying out his police duties. Knee constraint is something that's legal to do. He happened to die because it was his fault, Floyd's fault, and he's entitled to immunity. An officer is entitled to qualified immunity unless you can show that an exact same factual case was ruled a constitutional violation before your case came. Because there is no exact factual situation of an African-American man being thrown out and handcuffed behind his back and thrown on the ground with 3 officers on his back, because the facts aren't exactly the same, Tricia, he gets qualified immunity. That's how distorted that doctrine is. That's why Karen Bass and the Black Caucus put qualified immunity change in there as key. But you asked what are some of the barriers to actually going to this wraparound safety. Warrior policing is the DNA of American policing. It is hyper vigilant, hyper aggressive. It looks at poor Black communities and poor communities of color, poor immigrant communities, marginalized communities, as not as full of struggling human beings. They look at them as a war zone. And they look at them as a staging area where they can be hyper aggressive, get a good shoot, and then get into SWAT, so the incentive system is not to see poor Black children and poor Latinx children as needing protection and help. They look at these communities as staging grounds to be able to use all of their weapons, all of their aggressive war tactics, because they're conducting a war on gangs, on drugs, on violence, getting out of the ghetto and into protected communities. So they see themselves, it's called thin blue line policing, because they're the blue cordon around the ghetto that makes sure that the violence stays contained. It's a model that comes from plantations. The plantation police, their job was to make sure the slaves stayed on the plantation, right? Well, this is a great grandchild of that policing. And I'll never forget it, and they can't hear that. The cops can't hear that. And I'll tell you a story. When I was arm wrestling with Bratton, when he was LAPD's chief, he used to talk about London police, bobbies, and Sir Robert Peel. And I said, why are you talking about Sir Robert Peel? And Chief Bratton said, because he's the father of American policing. I said, no, he's not. I said I grew up in London. I know bobbies. We don't have bobbies in the United States. I said, so don't talk to me about bobbies. I said, U.S. policing comes from slavery. And he would yell and scream at me. I forgot. I said, no. So I took him to a slave artifact store at Slauson and Crenshaw in LA. It's a store that has the shackles. If you have a store like that in your neighborhood, buy the art. I buy the shackles. I buy the lynching ropes, because if we don't have them, they will simply bury them and deny slavery ever happened, like they deny the Holocaust ever happened. So I took him to this slave artifact store, and Gail it's called Sable Images. It's now online, but at the time she had all of the artwork and the posters of from antebellum of the South, and I had gotten Bratton an antebellum. Long story short, I took him to this store, and he found the cabinet that I wanted him to find, and he asked Gail to take out what was in the cabinet. It was plantation police badges. And Bratton took out his badge and he took out the plantation badges. They were the same. The only difference was that instead of City of Los Angeles around the edge, it was Green Acres Plantation. And he said, I get it. Okay, I understand. So when you talk about what it takes to change the warrior policing, I don't know that you can change that DNA. I have tried for 40 years. And I've done it from the outside, I've done it from the inside. You can change the thinking at the top, but all of the money in this corrupt system, all of the promotional incentives, all of the imagery and identity is with the shock and awe warrior officer who doesn't know the name of anybody, but when what he or she knows is that when he's in a poor Black community, he calls it stick time. He gets to use all of his weapons. He gets to use all of his weapons because he says the crime is too high. I'm there to suppress the crime. They end up suppressing the community and the humanity. They don't see individuals whom they're serving. They see fodder for arrests. They see a staging ground in which they're playing out a war. That's why you see the paramilitary, when they're going in their trucks to execute a warrant, looks like they're going to a mission outside of the green zone in Iraq. That's because they are. So when you ask what it takes to unwind, what I have found is two things. There's either an epiphany that happens within that officer. Those are the officers who've changed themselves. When I began to work with Chief Charlie Beck, who is a prince, his grandfather was an LAPD deputy chief. His father was a deputy chief. He became chief, part of the dynasty. White cop who used to be a gang crash officer. I sued him several times. He had an epiphany, and when I met him about 6 years after the Rampart gangster cop scandal, I noticed the swagger was gone. He welcomed me into his division. He said, I need your help. I went there thinking, is this candid camera? Really? This ex-gang crash cop wants me to come talk to him? I said, yeah, okay, where are the cameras? Where's the hoax? Didn't trust him as far as I could throw my car. And after spending an hour with him, I looked at him and I said, Charlie, where's the gang crash cop? The shock and awe not search and destroy, the gang crash cop I sued. And I said, where's the swagger? Where's the arrogance? Where's the screw you?
Where'd he go?
Who are you and what have you done with Charlie Beck?
Right.
And he said something profound. He said, Connie, when I was a young cop, I was too stupid to understand that search and destroy doesn't just destroy the community, it destroys you. He was calling the policing that he did search and destroy. And he said, I looked in the mirror and I could feel the dehumanization. I was dehumanizing the people in this community and I was dehumanizing myself. And I decided I had to change. And when he became chief, he said, I don't want my cops in these desperate, despairing communities we've left at the bottom of the well. Those are my words and Derek Bell's words. But he basically said these abandoned, traumatized communities. I want to know, can my cops actually help this community get healthier? Can my cops help the community organize itself for safety instead of enforcement? That was his vision. That's a radical vision for anybody, never mind a former crash cop. So you have a few of the former warriors transform themselves into guardians, just like Bo Taylor, a former Rolling 60s Crip, transformed himself, and he called his journey not warrior to guardian. The gang members call their similar epiphany and transformation inside from predator to peacemaker. So it's very interesting. The cops who transform themselves go through a similar psychological transformation, and so do the former gang members. But those are very few. They escaped the physics of warrior policing and shock and awe, crush and control, search and destroy, incarcerate, mass incarceration, enforcement. They escaped that paradigm, which is the paradigm for most cities, and they created a parallel paradigm for guardian safety with the
Right.
community. The community co-created it with Chief Beck and with people like me, with academics from not Brown, but UCLA and USC.
Oh,
So,
we're going to get some from Brown to help out.
the academics are important, Tricia. They're
Yeah,
important because
yeah,
they
the
help
research.
evaluate, they help collect the data, they help prove that the model works, because they're not going to accept it. The only reason we could protect this model because it's too soft for the warrior. They call
Right.
it women's policing. The first time they called it women's policing, I said, you're damn right, it's women's policing. It's smart, it's strategic, it solves the problem without violence and without trauma.
And it's less expensive.
Less expensive. It gets the job done of providing safety. I said, yeah, it is women's policing, because you meet
Right.
heads, you blockheads over here who think it's about mowing everybody down and throwing everybody in prison. All you've done is create more violence. The
Right.
war on gangs, we documented with a report with UCLA and 40 other subject matter experts. It actually increased gangs. It increased gangs. It's by 6 times. We had after spending $34 billion on a war on gangs that created the mass incarceration stuff. 6 times as many gangs and 80,000 gang members. I mean, all that money,
right? But
more of the problem.
Right? They need more gangs. They're creating more community for them to mow and to shock and awe, right? I mean, it's sort of it's a production, right? It's an economic incentive, right?
Yes,
And
money,
it's an identity
and
incentive.
the money in the prison industrial system is a huge incentive system that you've got to unwind. It's kind of like the
Right.
military industrial complex, where
Industrial complex.
they're spending $1 trillion on an F-35 that no branch of the military wants. $1 trillion over that one plane's lifetime. You talk about, you're not going to find the money for revitalizing ghettos in police budgets. That's where the money is, in that plane, in the Osprey. That's $2 trillion right there for two weapon systems we don't need anymore. We never needed them. So it's in the industrial, the defense industrialized
Right,
system that
of
we
which the
have.
police are a subset.
They're a subset, but
Right.
they don't have the $1 trillion. You can take all the budgets, you can take all 18,000 police budgets, and you're not going to get but a down payment maybe on what LA County needs to end the entrenched poverty.
So given that, this is really, I think, a really good place to ask this question, which is, how do we deal with the kinds of transformations of the expenditures for policing that not, that what we're describing here requires? So, talk a bit about the defunding of the police as a strategy and abolition policing, right? The movement for abolition. These are different things, but they're related. And I'm really curious to hear what you think of each one of them, given the framework that you've set up here.
I talk about refunding the community because the slogan defunding the police empowers my opponents. I also talk, if you want to talk, I want abolished the system of policing that we have right now. We don't have the power to eliminate policing. I'm not sure. The communities that I'm in, my clients, they ask me for humane police who protect them and help them change the conditions that make them feel endangered and traumatized 24/7, because we've left this larger society has decided ghettos and barrios don't just spring up. They are engineered. They are structured, and they are structured by those of us who live in privileged and safe areas, because our politicians vote for the policies that redline, exclude, and sink these communities into desperation and despair. And then we pile on punitive policies to make sure they get wiped out. It's pathological public policy is what it is. And you have a policing system that enforces that pathology. So the whole paradigm of safety in ghettos requires much more than changing the system of policing. It requires reorganizing government to actually deliver a safe community, a healthy community, because healthy communities are safe. You don't need shock and awe where I live. People have
Right.
access to clinics, they have banks, they have grocery stores,
They have
they have,
jobs,
they have jobs, you
they
know,
have
they
transportation,
have
they have
mental, they have
resources.
counseling. If the kids in this neighborhood get in trouble, they're not put in a child prison. They're given therapy and counseling and
Right.
5 chances, and they're not charged if they go, if they take someone's car, they're charged with joyriding, a misdemeanor.
Right.
Our kids in our ghettos get charged with grand theft auto and
Right.
are immediately tried as
Right.
an adult and sent to prison.
Right.
So
If they have drugs at a party, then it's experimentation, and they get, some sort of treatment
treatment
for drug
at a
treatment.
spa in Malibu. Our kids are immediately criminalized and sent
Right,
to
with no
prison.
defense, very limited legal representation, no resources for, they're held until, without bail, so on and so forth.
Mass incarceration. That's what the new Jim Crow, that's what the brilliant Michelle Alexander wrote about. And if you haven't read that book, you have no right to talk
Yeah.
about this stuff.
Yeah, that is true.
So you ask a really, really important question, which is, can you unwind warrior policing and get guardian policing within the warrior paradigm? And I've concluded that you can't. When you have that deeply dysfunctional kind of fortress of toxic policing,
Right.
you have to create a parallel system that demonstrates something different. And then the cops who want to change come to that system, and the community backs that system. And then eventually the chiefs who are talking guardian policing and community policing, partnership policing, policing that tries to make the community whole rather than destroy it, then the political momentum behind that can gain. But diving into warrior policing that refuses to even admit that there's a problem and has doubled down on Blue Lives Matter more. Right now, we're in a period, Tricia, where policing inside of itself is in a civil war, and it's under siege from without. It's under siege by the community. 20 million people marched, 15 million of which are estimated were white Americans. That's never happened in the history of any civil rights. I mean, even after the Pettus Bridge prompted white Americans and Jewish Americans to come join John Lewis and King in those marches that finally ended up in the Voting Rights Act in 65, 20,000, maybe 25,000 most. So the Black Lives Matter movement created a revolution in white participation, which is what has to happen for anything to count in this country. We've been talking about what the police have been doing for 400 years. But
Lord have mercy.
It's not until white America decides that it's a problem. That's what, a white dominion system that is entrenched in the Constitution, that's what we get. We're in the framework of a form of a slaveocracy that was, yes, it's got soaring ideals of liberty paired with slavery. And that's the complexity and the duality of our system. And it's perfectible, which is why I'm not picking cotton and you're not picking cotton anymore.
Not today.
Not today. If we don't stop this industrialized vote nullification and this industrialized entrenchment of minority rule and the budding fascism that we saw under Trump, because it's on its way now with 47 states at the state level. So they've gotten the state government machinery. And if we don't manage to stop this, the insurrection coup of January 6th is ongoing. If we don't stop that, we may go back to making America white again.
I mean,
and in the context of that, you're trying to change policing. And I think that you can change policing, but not until we settle this larger framework of whether we're going to even have the Madisonian framework. We don't have a democracy right now. We have an oligarchy with electoral overtones. But with the Madisonian framework, you at least have a blueprint for achieving democracy. And if we lose that, you can forget about changing policing or anything else. We're going to be
policing becomes a small piece of even a bigger problem. So, but you in an article that I was reading, talk about the longest American war being the Civil War, and that that we're fighting the last battles, or at least the most recent iteration of the battles of a civil war. And everything you're saying now really mirrors, I think, that observation. How can we really help this new segment of white Americans and others who have come around to seeing through agitation, activism, better social media, visibility, narrative, history, data, to get this group of people who are now more aware of it, to understand that this is still a fundamental, battle over the soul of who this country is, and that it is at the core. And so when you say that policing begins with slavery, it's not just a technical matter, it's an ideological matter. It's a question about who is property and whose behavior is to be policed for profit, and who needs to be, whose labor and physical presence needs to be controlled in order for society to understand itself as not just safe, but as it wishes to be. Yeah. So how do we make this broader change? Because I think this is a very important point, that this is America's longest war, and we're still fighting it all the time. And everything you just said to me really mirrors that.
Yeah, these are the last, maybe penultimate battles of the American Civil War. And the North won the military battle, but then ceded the cultural battle. And we're still fighting those culture wars. It's not by accident that Willie Horton and the Southern strategy, it's just, we have different phases of it each decade. Right. Tricia, this is going to sound counterintuitive. When I talk to white audiences and powerful white oligarchs about what needs to happen, I talk about their interests. I don't explain to them what you and I are talking about, because it shuts them down. They can't think that anything that they're supporting has a nexus to slavery. The denial is ironclad. But I have learned to talk to police and to the wealthy in this wealthy white folks in this country who actually control the levers of power. Why it's in their interests, their business interests, their stability interests, why it's in their interests not to keep coming back to this stuck on stupid boomerang that we're in. I mean, I actually have billionaires who call me after a race riot that's triggered by the police and say, "Can you stop them from rioting?" And I just have to bite my cheek, not to go into some history on some history lesson on slavery, but everything from the so-called Karens who are policing where Black bodies can be, that descends directly from slavery. In the South, if you were white and you reached the age of 18, you were obligated as your public service to join a slave patrol. Every able-bodied white person every white male over the age of 18 was required to join slave patrols. And the slave patrols were licensed for 3 years of service in Alabama, 5 years in Mississippi, depending on which mass enslavement state you were in. You were required to patrol the woods, because their fear was that a slave would go in the woods with a match and set the plantation and the woods on fire and set the master's house on fire. So the patrols were to make sure that the Africans stayed on the plantation. You were there to suppress and contain the slaves. But you were licensed. If you found a slave in the woods off the plantation with an incendiary device, you were authorized in 2 states to kill on the spot. Other states allowed you to do 30 lashes. That's where, so when you have every white citizen deputized to control where Black bodies are, think of 150 years later, you're in the park, you don't look like you belong there because you're a Black man doing your yoga or your exercises or watching birds. And a white woman feels like, oh my God, I don't want him there. That's the communal psychology that's been passed down. Now, if I talk to the folks about that problem of white people calling the police because they're uncomfortable with black people being in a park or a pool or a barbecue pit or where they are, and I talk about slavery, they think I need my medication refilled.
I know.
So I
Yeah, we
don't
need
go
to.
there.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
go there.
Yeah.
You and I know that's where it comes from. That's enough, because we need to understand the depth of pathology that we're trying to unwind, right? But when you
Yeah.
talk about policy, what I talk about is I talk forward and I talk positively. And I talk about the benefits to the people who are afraid of having the status quo changed. And I talk
Yeah.
about how, if you're really interested in stopping police triggered rebellions and riots, here's how you do it. Stop
Right.
backing this stuff. Understand that right now the agenda is, since we're fighting for the very democracy that hangs, or the potential to achieve the Madisonian framework that allow us to achieve democracy, the Madisonian framework that allowed us to actually have emancipation, a civil war, and all the rest of it. The mission right now is, as much as toxic as that system is, try protecting African Americans without that framework, without that judicial system, without the rule of law. You could forget it. So to me, critical path, Tricia, is passing HR 1 and HR 4 to stop the juggernaut of vote nullification and Xing out of African American and just, we have to preserve the electoral machinery for majority rule. And if we don't, none of what you and I are talking about can be changed. I guess the bottom line is, we know how to change this stuff. We know how to change the mindset, the metrics, the mission.
Right. It's will. It's volume of intensity and will.
It's will.
So yeah. So let me turn to some. We have a profound level of questions. So you have generated, which is why I was so excited that you were able to join us, because you're so you have such a clear vision, but also it's based both in tremendous levels of education and research and theorization, and profound levels of practice on the ground. I can't think of anybody who, has spoken to as many police as you have. I try to avoid them at all costs. And also that, you've seen a lot of changes, but you also know that those changes, this isn't a moral self-development question. It's not an aha moment for every individual being, and yet you also want to get as many people to change as possible, right? Because you need both. So I'm thrilled with a lot of great questions here. Let me just offer a couple that follow from where we just were, and then I'll just keep going through them. So if people have questions now, I mean, there are many in the queue, but please feel free to add some more. So someone wants to know how we can educate BIPOC officers, right, of this history within law enforcement culture, who are in denial of the real story. And to that question, I would add, what do we make of this warrior culture in that we know targets Black and brown and poor communities of color, especially? Why are people of color, particularly Black men, police, right? And how do we educate them about this history of law enforcement culture?
Well, that's where I learned policing, was by representing Black officers, male and female. We represented gay officers, Jewish, because policing is a xenophobic culture. It is so racist. I actually think that the prism through which to understand the endemic racism is to let the Black officers talk. Because I was just with Deputy Chief Fred Booker, who grew up on a sharecropping farm in Mississippi. So he came from Mississippi, came to LA, used to get stopped as a teenager all the time, proned out, beaten by LAPD, and said, I'm going to join this organization change. At the time, the squad cars were segregated. And when he got out of the academy, Daryl Gates had ordered the squad cars desegregated because white officers refused to ride with Black recruits, Black graduates of the academy. And when he came to his squad car that he was assigned to, and there were two white officers sitting in the front, and they told him, nigger, get in the back. That was his welcome to his first patrol assignment. And they explained to him that, as far as they were concerned, desegregating the squad cars was not an option because no white officer could ever take an order from a nigger officer. That's what they told him.
Right.
45 years later, he's a deputy chief. But his arc of fighting the racism from within, there are only two ways to survive as an officer of color. And this doesn't even apply to the female officers who have to have even more fortified strategies because they get wiped out completely. If you don't sleep blue, they don't protect you and they set you up to be ambushed. They call your backup off. I have represented women who were just, who had Mark Furman as a training officer. That's all you need to know. But when you talk to Black officers, what I understood was there are only two ways to survive inside of a culture that is designed for the oppression of Black people. Because the anti-Black bias is the strongest inside of policing. They've even got codes for it. When you remember the transcripts from the Christopher Commission report, if you haven't read those MDT transcripts, they're transcripts of the conversations cops have over the radio with one another and in response to calls. They have codes. I had a chapter in a book called NVN NHI. It's nigger versus nigger, no human involved. It means take your time responding to the call. So they actually have codes and nicknames for the different brands of anti-Black racism. That you saw it with the jokes that are passed around about George Floyd's murder. There was a Valentine passed around that had Floyd's picture on a heart and it said, "You leave me breathless." I mean, it is a cruel, misogynist, xenophobic, racist culture that has a number of really good officers who don't share in their hearts that philosophy. But the culture, the underground culture of policing, that back of the squad room culture, that the graveyard culture is still just as ugly. That's the underbelly. That's the really toxic strain. That's the DNA. That's the strain of DNA that you've got to kind of put to the side. Black officers deal with that every day. And inside, they're the inside agitators who do not internalize the mission of oppressing poor African Americans and doing the crushing containment. They really are there to try to learn everybody's name and try to help. You've seen good officers. Those are the officers who help me. Those are the officers I ride shotgun with.
And but they have to get on a payphone and drop in some coins, right? So I mean, their own lives are in danger.
They know. They're whispering in that payphone. This is 30 years ago now. Whispering in that payphone because as they said to me, as I said, "Why don't you guys rise up?" They said, "Connie, they are willing to kill white officers who don't obey them. What do you think they're going to do to me?"
Lord knows what they're going to do to you.
When you listen, Bernard Parks had drugs planted in his locker. He was a former Black chief of LAPD with whom I profoundly disagreed. But he was, all the Black officers are smarter. They've got graduate degrees. They have to be twice as qualified as a lot of the white officers just to survive and just to be recruited. An elite of Black brass in LAPD came up under Darrell Gates. But when Gates made Bernard Parks the first Black watch commander of Wilshire Division, those white sergeants in Wilshire Division planted drugs in his locker. So when you talk about the experiences of officers of color and female officers and gay officers and Jewish officers, all of whom are targeted by the toxic culture of policing because it's xenophobic and it's total control. You have to submit yourself to that culture and you have to prove that you're bluer than Black. Do you realize that Black officers weren't allowed to serve on gang details because the white officers thought they were allied with the Grape Street Crips and the Bloods? It was presumed that if you were Black and you lived in the neighborhood that you were a gang member or had members of your family as a gang member. It's nobody white is suspected of having nobody and members of their white families being part of a violent insurrectionist, domestic violent extremist white supremacist group. There's no question. The white officers don't get asked about that, although I think we have to now. But Black officers.
Well, yeah, there's clearly some alignment.
Black officers are suspect. And you have some officers who become bluer than Black, and others who are inside to change the culture. Um, LAPD is now majority of color, but I think about four, and this is just a thumbnail sketch from, as I said, as you said, I spend most of my days with cops. It's a thumbnail
Right.
calculation, but I think, Tricia, about four, it's a majority officers of color are now the majority of officers in LAPD. It's a sea change.
Right.
But the majority of the officers of color are Latino, as they should be. But I'd say 40% of the Latino Latinx officers have adopted the white frame of analysis. They have taken on
Right.
the white shock and awe anti-blackness. So
Right.
within,
Yeah, I think this is so
it's very
important,
complex.
Connie.
It's extremely complex.
Yeah, because we're still in a world where identity politics is how people think, social power is automatically organized. Oh, we just need Black faces in high places. We have all these, democratic cities with Black and female and queer, police chiefs, and the whole situation's what it is. And so, of course, many right wingers and many white supremacist advocates will say, this is your city, right? It's run by Democrats and it's run by white Black people, and women are in charge. And so why are you blaming white people? So what's so important here is, the rules of the culture can be controlled regardless of who's in the forefront of a given organization. And I think, you're really unpacking why that's the case. Let me ask you another question that's a consolidated question from two of our participants. One is framed in this way, which is that you, Connie Rice, mentioned, thank you so much for your presentation. You mentioned police unions a bit in passing. Can you speak more about what needs to happen to dismantle union agreements with cities that prevent reform beyond qualified immunity, even when a chief is relatively pro-reform? And then there was another question very similar to this about whether or not we could get rid of qualified immunity and also unions in general, and make police officers carry personal liability insurance like many of us do working in higher education. So I'm wondering, those seem interrelated there, so I'm combining them.
Okay, so the powers of the unions have been a major vector creating the metal jacket of impunity. So to the point where a judge in Southern California can't find out if an officer in her courtroom has lied on the stand in other cases. So they shield perjury. They shield the data on killings. You realize the FBI doesn't collect the number of police killings. That's like airlines not counting plane crashes. It's nuts.
Right.
But that's that jacket of impunity. They stop the data. They stop the revelation of discipline records. They codify standards for use of force that license shoot first, ask questions later, escalations of force. They actually protested, the union and LAPD protested Chief Beck's creation of a preservation of life award. Charlie Beck said, I don't want awards for when they use force. I want rewards for when the law allowed them to kill someone, but they didn't. The union grieved that, okay? So that's how extreme the culture and mentality police unions can have. Now, when you attack them, the problem with attacking police power, no, let me put it this way. The problem with thinking that you can attack police in court or anywhere else, you can win a case, but you're not going to change that system.
Mm-hmm.
The reason that you have this wraparound impunity is because it's not protecting just that cop. When you attack police, you're attacking the sovereign police power of the state. When you go after the police power of the state, Katie, bar the door, because they're not going to let you do it. That's why you have these perverse protections, because it's not just about some cop who's shooting too many people. It's about the state's police power. So the unions play a critical role in adding on top, adding and adding and adding layers
Mm-hmm.
that keep even the worst cops insulated from any accountability.
Right.
Police chiefs can't even fire bad apples.
Right.
They get
Right.
reinstated because they have wired the civil service process and the police bill of rights processes in the different states to protect all kinds of misconduct. Lying on the stand, you know, can't even, they have a license to lie. And so, how do
Right.
you attack that kind of power? You have to do it indirectly. I know that there are
Mm.
some movements to try to keep police unions from making contributions, but if you go at them directly, it increases their power. What I would
Mm.
do as opposed to it is say, if you are a DA, a judge, or any official, elected official in the criminal justice system, you can't take donations from police unions.
Mm-hmm.
So you
Mm-hmm.
restrict the amount of political money, who can take their political money, so that you can say
Mm-hmm.
anybody who, with whom you are going to have, over whom you have adjudicatory power, you can't take money from them. You know, lawyers, police unions should be able to bargain for benefits, uh, terms and conditions of employment, maybe
Mm-hmm.
even hiring, you know, but when it comes to public safety, because police are the only public servants who have a license to kill,
Right.
death is different, killing is different. And so you have to have better constraints, not looser ones. And what I would say is police unions should not be able to determine when cops get punished. They
Right.
should not be able to determine when cops get investigated. They should be able to provide representation for a cop. They should be able to insist on due process for officers. But they should not be creating the construct for determining justice with these kind when officers act outside of the law. So that's about unions, and just one. I had to learn to engage with the unions. I'll never forget the first time I went to talk to the LAPD union. I went to their headquarters. They fixed dinner for me. I was like a cat in a rocking chair factory. But they said, Connie, I want you to hear something. We need you to hear something. We need you to listen to us. And so I listened. And they said, we need you to understand why the Rodney King beating was a good beating. And I listened. And they said, he wasn't complying. I said, what do you mean? He moved. He kept moving. I said, are you talking about the involuntary flinching that a human body does when it is struck with a steel baton at full force? Well, we needed him to lie still. He's a big black guy and he just came out of prison and they lift weights in there. And when they're on PCP, we can't control them. So we had to keep beating him. Notice the defense in the Chauvin trial. That expert, the one expert that they could find to say that this wasn't a use of force, what did he say? He wasn't completely complying because he was
Mm-hmm.
trying to breathe. By
Mm-hmm.
moving, Chauvin had
Mm-hmm.
the right to still keep his knee on the neck. So that's union thinking. So think about that. Now that's what you have to unwind, but I had to hear it in order to understand, oh, you have such a pathological need to control and have total compliance that it's gotten to a level that's not just exceeding common sense, it's exceeding all sense. And you have
Right.
to understand if that's their thinking, you have to understand that to be able to plug in and uncounter that. So you asked about qualified immunity, which is correlative to the impunity infrastructure that they've created. The Supreme Court has helped them by making a very distorted doctrine that says even if the officer's underlying conduct is egregious,
Mm-hmm.
illegal, or even criminal, they're entitled to qualified immunity if you can't show that there was a prior case with the exact same facts that was previously declared unconstitutional.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So it's an Asherian stairwell, and that's not my phrase. That's the phrase of a Trump-appointed Fifth Circuit judge. So you know he's no flaming liberal. He called the Section 1983 qualified immunity bar that keeps George Floyd's family from pursuing a Section 1983 civil rights claim in court, federal court, but there are state equivalents that allow you to go into state court for civil rights violations done by police. Chauvin could have gotten qualified immunity had he raised it. Now, the reason to get rid of this doctrine and substitute it with protections for officers and George Floyd's family, because you don't want officers who make good faith mistakes to have to bear personal liability. They're due process. They should have the immunity that other bureaucrats have. If you make a good faith mistake, you are not going to have to pay out of pocket. But Tricia, the reality is that no cop pays indemnification. Look at Joanna Schwartz's she's a law professor out at UCLA. She is the world's expert in American qualified immunity for cops. Her law review articles, the footnotes have footnotes, so you know, I know better than to opine in an area where you got to go to the microfiche to the Civil Rights Act of 1870, and where the footnotes have footnotes. It's too arcane an area for anybody outside of law professors to understand. All you have to understand is that it would have protected Chauvin from civil liability for what he did. That's how distorted this, and when Trump judges on the Fifth Circuit, one of the most conservative federal circuits in the country, when they say it creates an Asherian stairwell, you know, that Escher, that artist that does stairways going this way and this way and this way, and you can't tell what's up and what's down. A Trump judge called it an Asherian stairwell that's a sand trap for Section 1982. So you can't even find conservative jurists who agree that qualified immunity as it exists right now is okay. Even Clarence Thomas, with whom I agree about nothing, says that qualified immunity needs to change. So we can't, Karen Bass has a reasonable framework. There are other ways of going about eliminating this Asherian stairwell, this sand trap for Section 1983 claims. There are ways to modify it, or you can get rid of it and you can replace it with vicarious liability, meaning the city or the county pays for the damages. You can replace it with indemnification, which all police officers have. Every cop in this country is indemnified. They already have protection from having to pay out of pocket for their mistakes, or for illegal killings, or for even intentional killings. So there are a lot.
So it's indirectly. So you're saying our best strategy overall is to really try to change the impact of those who want to extend the power and preserve the power of the police to be protected and under any and all circumstances, and that by attacking the police directly, we actually build resistance to change among citizens who are not already completely aligned with a more progressive agenda. Is that your?
Yes, and I think that you want to keep the moral high ground. When you come in and you say, I want to protect officers from being bankrupted when they make good faith mistakes, which used to be the old common law standard, good faith immunity. You're not saying, you're not saying I want cops to be unprotected. You're saying you want a reasonable protection for officers and a clear glide path for George Floyd's family and for Rodney King's family to be able to get, at least as Kamala Harris called it, a measure of justice through civil rights actions. The kinds of cases that Johnny Cochran, Crump, people like me do. You want a fair arena for both. And politically, that's the only viable way you're going to get the changes that you want. You can get the protections that we need for poor African American families without creating a war with the unions, which we don't have the political clout to win. So it's a matter of strategy and critical path analysis and power analysis, and it's what you and Doc and us old folks do. Because there are ways to make a dent in this, and this may be the only opening in time we can do this. It's
a special time. And so it's important that we think carefully about that. I have two more questions before that I can get to, I think, here. One is, what do you think are the best measures for the Biden administration to support, in addition to the George Floyd Act, that you think would help create the parallel systems of policing that's the road to change? Because as we're saying here now, you know, our window vaguely open, or it's ajar, right? And, you know, how can we take advantage of it, and what can we expect, and what can we lobby the Biden administration to do?
Pass HR 1 and HR 4 to stop the destruction of the Madisonian framework, because we're not going to be able to get anything done on policing if we lose any capacity to vote. Get the George Floyd Act in, because it creates for the first time national standards for all 18,000 police forces across the country. If the qualified immunity section stays in, it might not, but you come back at it the next term. So George, but the thing that Susan Rice, the head of policy making for the Biden administration, the thing that Dr. Rice and Vice President Harris and President Biden can do is adopt the framework of the McCone Commission, which said you have to transform policing. You have to do two things. It's not enough to change your police, change your system of policing from the alienating, racist, occupation style, crush and control systems that we're fighting in our lawsuits and that people are marching against. It's not enough to change that to partnership, wraparound safety, or even just community policing. That's important to do. But even if you change your police, you are not going to stop the toxic physics that we see in inner cities until you do both change your police and end what the McCone Commission called the conditions that create a spiral of despair. Until you end the entrenched and orchestrated and engineered impoverishment of ghettos and barrios and Native American reservations and rural white communities, because they may not have a crack epidemic, but they've got a vortex of despair of their own, because we have marginalized poor people and put them at the bottom of the well. Until you change that as your public policy and your status quo and your default in these communities, you are going to continue to have the kind of shock and awe destruction with both policing and the other functions of government. This isn't just about policing. Until you decide to end the thin blue line and the red lining of these ghettos and barrios, you change the conditions and make these communities healthy. You refund these communities, because you've defunded them for 80 years minimum. And until you do that, you are not touching the third rail.
Yeah, no, you're not. I couldn't agree with you more, Connie. Profoundly wonderful conversation, and extremely important. Let me just remind people, because I didn't mention your book, Power Concedes Nothing, One Woman's Quest for Social Justice in America, which is worthwhile reading and very powerful, and speaks to a number of these issues here. I just think, you know, you're just amazing, and this is such important work. I don't know what else we can do, but keep fighting the good fight. And I just want to thank you for just a riveting conversation. You know, I think you've closed it out perfectly there. So I don't want to ruin your brilliant ending, and come back anytime. This third rail is going to be with us for a minute. And we need everyone to do all they can do to be a part of making this change as much as we can. And it's definitely a long distance run. As you said, we've been at this 400 years, so we better keep our sneakers on and keep moving. But Connie, you're just a blessing. Thank you for all you've done. You know, hang in there. We need you some more. We need you to keep fighting. And you know, you're welcome anytime. It's really wonderful to see you.
It's been wonderful to be with you, Tricia. You know, you're such a gift, I tell you, to all of this change, the physics of change. You've got to have the folks who know how to convene, who know how to teach, who know how to lay the groundwork. And thank you for all you've done.
Yeah, well, it's you know, if I can make space for having people see what you're doing and why these things are so important, and to help people with the memory, you know, because, you know, you go back to Rodney King, and, you know, for me, that's yesterday, but for a lot of young people, that's an unknown moment. And for many whites who thought Rodney King was, a crazed maniac, assaulting police on the side of the road, right? We need this memory. We need this informed, educated memory. So thank you for keeping us honest on this history and helping people connect the dots as far back as need be. So, we're gonna keep fighting the good fight, and we adore you. Thank you, Connie Rice, and thanks everyone for joining us here today. And we'd love to hear from you again. Let us know what you think, and we'll put a survey in the chat. But also, sign up on the mailing list. We're gonna keep doing what we do. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. And thanks for joining us today at CSREA. Bye-bye, Connie. Great to have you.